The house was still when I realized I no longer belonged in it. Late afternoon light cut across the living room, dust hanging in the air, and I stood there holding my keys, listening to my own heartbeat echo off walls I had paid for, protected, and slowly disappeared inside. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was dismissive, heavy with everything that had gone unsaid, especially from the one person I thought would never turn away from me. If you're watching this and you've ever felt invisible in a place that was supposed to be yours, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. Stories like this are closer to home than we admit. I was a widow, a mother, a homeowner, and somehow none of that mattered in that moment. I could feel something break, not loudly, but finally, that was the moment everything started to unravel. I was sitting in my living room when the room suddenly stopped feeling like mine. I am 68 years old, a widow, and this house is in my name. Yet in that moment, I felt dismissed, reduced, and quietly pushed aside. The television went silent, not because I turned it off, but because someone else decided I no longer mattered in that space. What hurt most was not the disrespect itself. It was the stillness beside it. My daughter stood there, close enough to reach, far enough to disappear. I waited for her to meet my eyes, to remember whose home this was, to remember me. She did not. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of my years in my knees and the weight of that silence in my chest. I did not argue. I did not explain. I reached for my keys and felt something inside me loosen and tighten at the same time. As I walked toward the door, I realized this was the moment I stopped enduring and started seeing my life clearly at last. I used to know every sound in my house. After my husband passed, the mornings were quiet but familiar. Like the home and I were learning how to breathe together again. I kept my routine simple. Coffee at the kitchen table, windows cracked open, the radio low. I was lonely. Yes, but I was still myself. This was my space, shaped by decades of choices, memories, and care. When my daughter Emily asked if she and her husband Jason could stay for a while, I did not hesitate. I told myself this was what family did. I believed love meant opening the door wider, even when the house already felt large. Having them there filled rooms that had been empty. I cooked real dinners again. I heard laughter down the hall. I felt useful, needed, and steady. At first, everything felt temporary and manageable. I adjusted without thinking. I shared closets, shifted schedules, and told myself flexibility was kindness. I did not keep track, because love is not supposed to feel like accounting. I thought patience would protect the harmony I wanted so badly. Instead, it trained me to step aside. Looking back now, that was the beginning. The moment my kindness started quietly rewriting where I belonged inside my own home, I did not see it yet. It did not happen all at once. There was no single argument, no clear line where things shifted. It happened in inches, in pauses, in small decisions I barely noticed making. I moved rooms so others could be comfortable. I waited to use my own kitchen. I adjusted my schedule to match theirs, telling myself this was temporary, that flexibility was love. I started eating later so no one felt rushed. I watched television with the volume low, then with headphones, then not at all. Bills increased and I paid them without comment. Groceries disappeared faster and I told myself prices were just higher now. Each time I swallowed a thought, I felt responsible for the calm that followed. I learned how to stay quiet in my own house. I measured my footsteps. I chose smaller portions. I apologized for things I did not cause. When tension appeared, I smoothed it over. Believing peace required sacrifice. What I did not see was how often the sacrifice was always me. Days blurred together, marked by repetition instead of choice. I stopped offering opinions because they complicated things. I told myself it was easier to agree than explain. Every compromise felt small alone, but together they formed a pattern, one where my comfort ranked last. I was still the homeowner, yet I lived like a guest asking permission to exist. Slowly, my name mattered less than my function. I became the one who covered costs and avoided conflict. The space I occupied shrank, not physically, but emotionally. I was present without being considered. I told myself patience was strength. I told myself understanding was maturity, but patience without boundaries does not earn respect. It trains people to take more. By staying silent, by adapting again and again. I taught everyone exactly how far they could push, and no one pushed harder than silence allowed. My daughter watched quietly, and that silence cut. I replay that moment more than I want to admit, not the words that were thrown at me, but the quiet that followed. My daughter stood nearby, close enough to feel, distant enough to disappear. I waited for a sign, a glance, anything that said I still mattered in that room. Nothing came. I remembered all the times I had stepped in for her, the scraped knees, the late-night phone calls, the moments when I made myself loud so she could feel safe. I had believed that kind of protection came back around, standing there. I realized how wrong that belief was. Each time disrespect crept into the house, I looked to her. I told myself she was tired, overwhelmed, stuck in the middle. I made excuses because it hurt less than admitting the truth. Silence felt easier to forgive than cruelty, but silence does not sit in the middle. It leans somewhere, in that stillness. Something inside me shifted. I was not just hurt, I was awake. I saw that my quiet endurance had shielded everyone except me. By saying nothing, I had protected their comfort while erasing my own. I stopped waiting for her to speak. I stopped hoping she would choose differently. That hope had kept me standing still far too long. As painful as it was, the clarity felt steady, almost gentle. I understood then that if I wanted safety, I would have to give it to myself. And that meant leaving, not in anger, but in truth. That realization followed me to the door. I did not announce my decision. Once the truth settled inside me, I moved quietly, as if noise might undo my resolve. I picked up my keys, paused at the doorway, and took one last breath of a space that no longer felt safe to stay small in. I walked out without explaining, without waiting to be understood. My body knew what my mouth no longer needed to say. Outside, the air felt cooler, cleaner. Each step away loosened something tight in my chest. I was afraid. But it was a steady kind of fear, the kind that comes with choosing yourself. I did not know where the night would take me. I only knew I could not remain where respect had become optional. The uncertainty felt lighter than the weight I had been carrying for years. I checked into a quiet hotel just past 9 in the evening. The room was simple, unfamiliar, and blessedly still. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to my own breathing, realizing how long it had been since silence felt kind. For the first time in a long while, nothing was demanded of me. I had left behind the shrinking. What remained was calm, and a sense that I was standing at the beginning of something I had prepared for. Morning came softly after the night away, and with it a calm I had not felt in years. Sitting alone, I found myself thinking about a small drawer in my bedroom, one that most people never noticed because it stuck just enough to be ignored. I had not opened it in a long time, not because I forgot what was inside, but because I stopped believing I needed it. For more than 35 years, I worked in county records. My days were filled with deeds, titles, signatures, and dates. I learned early that feelings shift, stories change, but paper remains steady. Ink does not argue. It does not raise its voice. It simply states what is true. That drawer held the documents I trusted more than promises. Among them was the deed to my house, my name printed clearly, unchanged by who occupied the rooms or how loud they felt entitled to be. Holding that memory, I felt the difference between emotion and fact settle into place. I realized then that nothing had actually been taken from me. I had handed my authority away quietly, mistaking patience for surrender. Ownership is not just about walls and keys. It is about recognizing when you already have standing. Looking at my life through that lens, my fear softened into resolve. I did not need to argue or defend myself. I did not need to convince anyone of my worth. The structure was already there, waiting. All that was left was to act with the same clarity I once filed away every day. I understood then that strength does not announce itself. It waits patiently until remembered, and when used correctly, it restores balance, dignity, and order without noise, without cruelty, and without losing yourself in the process at all again today. I did not feel angry anymore. I felt clear. Once I remembered what I owned and what the law recognized, the noise inside me settled. I stopped rehearsing speeches that would never be heard and let facts take their place. Instead of confronting anyone, I reached for structure. I contacted someone who understood process, timelines, and documentation. I spoke without emotion. Not because I lacked it, but because emotion had already taken enough from me. I laid out only what mattered: ownership, duration, and boundaries, and listened as the situation became simple. That simplicity felt like relief. For years, I had tried to explain my needs, justify my discomfort, and soften my words so no one else felt threatened. All that effort had kept me exhausted and unseen. Clarity asked nothing of me except honesty. I realized power does not come from convincing people who benefit from misunderstanding you. It comes from standing on solid ground and letting reality speak. Once I chose that, the imbalance shifted without a single raised voice. There was comfort in knowing I did not have to prove anything. I only had to proceed correctly. Calm decisions replaced emotional endurance. Boundaries replaced hope, and for the first time in years, I felt steady enough to follow through. I was ready to let consequences do the talking, quietly and without drama. This approach honored my dignity and allowed order to return without cruelty or chaos again. I woke up early the next morning with a calm I trusted. There was no rush, no anger driving me. I made coffee, sat at the small table, and began taking back what had quietly been taken from me. I called the service providers first. The accounts were in my name, always had been. I asked for suspension, not as a threat, simply as a decision. Then I contacted the bank and froze the extra card I had issued out of convenience and care. Each step felt clean and factual, like closing files at the end of a workday. What surprised me was not how easy it was, but how necessary it felt. I was not punishing anyone. I was removing access that had never been a right. Comfort had been mistaken for entitlement, and clarity has a way of correcting that misunderstanding quickly. Within hours, the imbalance revealed itself. Confusion surfaced where confidence used to sit. Frustration replaced certainty. I stayed quiet. I had learned that explanations invite debate, but boundaries speak for themselves. For years, I believed kindness meant absorbing discomfort. That morning, I understood kindness without limits becomes permission. Consequences are not cruel when they are proportional and lawful. They are instructions about reality. I did nothing else. I waited, calmly, patiently. I knew the next step would not be emotional. It would be formal, documented, and unavoidable. And when that moment came, the truth would not need my voice at all. The room felt still, and for the first time, that stillness worked for me, not against me. I finally trusted the process I had once helped others navigate without apology or fear of consequences ahead. I arrived at the office feeling steady, almost detached, as if the room belonged to facts rather than feelings. The table was plain, the chairs evenly spaced, the air neutral. I noticed immediately how tension filled the space for everyone else: restlessness, defensiveness, impatience. None of it reached me. I listened as explanations piled up around the room. I did not interrupt. I had learned that truth does not need urgency. When the documents were placed on the table, the energy shifted. Ownership, timelines, and numbers do not bend to emotion. They simply exist. I watched entitlement struggle when it met permanence. Confidence thinned, certainty cracked. What had once been loud grew scattered. I stayed quiet, grounded by the knowledge that nothing here required my approval to be valid. When my attention turned to my daughter, the weight of the moment settled. I saw fear behind her composure and exhaustion beneath loyalty. I I understood then that the real cost of this arrangement had always been hers. Dependency had asked her to shrink alongside me. I did not accuse. I did not plead. I shared a truth I could no longer carry alone, that a relationship sustained by my house and my money was not stability. It was delay. That independence would hurt, but dependence would hollow her out. The room grew still again. But this time the silence belonged to choice. Boundaries were laid out clearly, timelines defined, support ended without cruelty. What remained was responsibility. I left knowing the path forward was no longer negotiable. The waiting had ended, the terms were set, and whether anyone liked them or not, reality had finally been acknowledged. I felt no triumph in that moment, only gravity. Ending something unhealthy rarely feels victorious. It feels necessary. I understood that accountability can look like loss before it looks like growth, and that choosing order over chaos often costs comfort first. Still, I trusted that clarity would outlast resentment, and that this ending, however painful, was the beginning of something honest for all of us. Even when the truth arrives quietly, it changes everything. I chose not to be there during those 30 days. That was intentional. I learned that some endings need space, not supervision. I stayed away from the house, from updates, from the urge to check whether boxes were packed or emotions were flaring. Silence had once frightened me. Now it felt earned. I trusted the process I had set in motion and refused to hover over it. Letting go meant resisting the temptation to manage other people's reactions. This was no longer my work, occasionally. Confirmations arrived quietly. Paperwork moved forward. Timelines held. Each small notice reminded me that things were unfolding without my presence, just as they should. I felt no need to intervene. I spent that time somewhere calm, rebuilding routines that belonged only to me. Mornings slowed down. Evenings grew lighter. I noticed how much energy had been tied to anticipation and how peaceful it felt to release it. The silence was no longer heavy. It was purposeful. It marked completion, not avoidance. What needed to end was ending. As the final day approached, I felt ready, not anxious. The house was about to be mine again, not just legally, but emotionally. I understood then that stepping back was part of reclaiming myself, and that my return would not be about confrontation, but about closure and peace. I returned in the late afternoon, keys warm in my hand, unsure what I would feel. When I opened the door, the house felt different immediately. The air moved freely. Sound settled instead of bouncing. The rooms no longer felt crowded by tension. Marks on the floor showed where furniture had been. Small holes in the walls caught the light. None of it felt sad. It felt honest. I opened every window and let fresh air push through, carrying away the weight that had lingered for years. I filled a bucket with warm water and soap and started with the floor. The movement was slow and steady. Each pass felt like reclaiming something simple and necessary. I was not erasing the past. I was clearing space for myself again. By evening, the house was quiet in a way that belonged to me, not empty, peaceful. I sat down, listened to the silence, and realized it no longer asked me to disappear. This space was mine again. And in that calm, I felt ready to look outward, to consider how distance had given everyone room to change, grow, and finally stand on their own, without guilt, fear, or need to return. Time passed more quietly than I expected. Weeks turned into months, and distance did what tension never could. My daughter began standing on her own feet, slowly, imperfectly, but honestly. She found a small place of her own, learned how to manage her time, and opened accounts that carried only her name. I listened when she needed to talk, but I did not rush in to fix anything. Watching her struggle was uncomfortable. Every instinct in me wanted to step forward, smooth edges, make things easier. Instead, I stayed present without rescuing. I learned that support does not always look like intervention. Sometimes it looks like trust. As for her husband, his presence faded once the house and money were no longer available. That disappearance answered questions I had stopped asking. Dependence cannot survive without something to lean on. What surprised me most was how steadiness replaced guilt. Boundaries did not break our bond, they clarified it. My daughter grew stronger because she had to. I grew calmer because I let her. Growth, I realized, is rarely gentle. It asks for discomfort before stability. Sitting with that truth changed how I see love, help, and responsibility, with space between us. Something healthier emerged. That understanding stayed with me and shaped the lesson I now carry forward. It prepared me to speak honestly about boundaries, silence, and self-respect going forward. I want to speak to you now, not as a character in a story, but as someone who learned something the hard way. Silence is often mistaken for kindness. I believed staying quiet would protect peace, but it only protected other people's comfort at the cost of my dignity. There is a difference between helping and disappearing. When love turns into obligation, respect slowly slips away. Boundaries are not punishments, they are information. They tell people where you end and where responsibility begins. Ownership is not only about property or paperwork, it is about choosing who has access to your time, your energy, and your voice. When those things are taken without consent, something inside you begins to shrink. Saying no is not cruelty, it is clarity. If any part of this feels familiar, I want you to hear this gently. You do not need to shout to be strong. You do not need to justify your limits to people who benefit from ignoring them. Firmness can exist without anger. Distance can exist without hatred. What I learned is simple, but not easy. Peace that requires your silence is not peace. It is a transaction you pay for with yourself. Real peace is built on respect, and respect starts with honesty. As I sit with that understanding now, I feel ready to close this chapter, not with bitterness, but with gratitude for the clarity it brought me. That awareness continues to guide my choices, reminding me daily that self-respect is quiet, steady, and always worth protecting in the end. I am sitting in my living room now, late afternoon light stretching across the floor. The house is quiet, but it no longer feels empty. It feels settled, like it knows I've returned to myself. This space reminds me that ownership is not just walls and keys, it is choice. It is the right to speak, to rest, to decide what I allow and what I release. Silence here is gentle, not demanding. If you stayed with me through this story, thank you. Telling it required honesty, and listening to it does too. I hope it gave you a moment to breathe, or maybe to recognize something in your own life that has been asking for clarity. If any part of this resonated, I invite you to reflect quietly, and if it feels right, share your experience in the comments. Your voice matters. Our stories help each other feel less alone. I am grateful for this calm, for this room, and for the understanding that self-respect grows when we choose ourselves with care. Wherever you are listening from, I hope you find that same steadiness waiting for you.